program. On the line with us is Ali Velshi, the host of MSNBC's Velshi, the author of a new book, Small Acts of Courage, A Legacy of Endurance and the Fight for Democracy. Ali, welcome back to the program. It's great to have you with us.
It's great to be with you. It's been too long. Thank you for having me back.
I agree. Thank you. Let's just go through the book. I found this to be just an extraordinary, touching, brilliant, informative. I mean, where you get into, sort of in the middle of the book, getting into some of these issues like, the Francophone culture in Canada, and is this racist? And let's just to start at the beginning here.
I know you'd like it because you like to sort of see contemporary events in the context of history, so I figured you'd appreciate that.
I love this book, and I encourage everybody to. I mean, this is an inspiring book as well as it's just marvelous. You start the book talking about getting shot. And you said that it led to an epiphany, which in turn led to this book. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, it was in Minneapolis. It was after the killing of George Floyd. It was the early days right after that where the video was all out there. Everybody knew what had happened. And yet, initially, the cops were not charged with anything. There was a remarkable frustration. There were demonstrations in Minneapolis. And on the Saturday night after he had been killed, it had been Monday in which he had been killed. On Saturday night, I was walking with a group of, I don't know if you want to call them protesters. They were marchers. They were ralliers. They were walking. It was entirely peaceful. They were singing songs. And suddenly the police got involved and closed off an intersection and started firing rubber bullets and gas canisters, tear gas canisters and flashbangs. And there was no provocation for this at all. And as we're covering it, as the tear gas came out, the crowd pushed back. So I'm now closest to the police and they could see us. We had cameras. We were there. In theory, they should have been looking through a scope. The whole point of a rubber bullet is it hits the ground, not you. And I got hit. While live on TV. And it occurred to me in that moment, Tom, that, 50 years earlier than that, my parents had struggled getting from, my great-grandparents went from India to South Africa, and they really tried to fight racism in South Africa, which became apartheid, and they went to Kenya where, they wanted to be part of a full society, and they finally made it to Canada. And I had made it to the United States. And I thought to myself, at least the fight for the basics about democracy and equality are over for us. And that's not true. And it was in that moment I realized I've had a very privileged upbringing. There are a lot of things wrong with our society, and we as journalists have to play a substantial role in fixing those wrongs.
Yeah, amen. I saw you on TV when you were shot. I was watching. I remember it well. From there, you get now stepping back into your family's history. You talk about between 1830 and 1870, nearly 2 million workers left. This is after Britain basically, screwed up India. Left the country in search of better prospects. That was the Big Bang, you write. The Indian diaspora was born, and that led to your grandfather ultimately ending up in Mahatma Gandhi's ashram. Tell us about that.
Well, my family had gone from Gujarat, and when you were leaving, if you were leaving Gujarat in the 1800s, you probably went from the port of Bombay, and then you went on the ships that went from Bombay, and many of those went to Africa. Some went to the West Indies, but typically they weren't going to Europe and America. So my family ended up in South Africa. Small business people. When I say small, I mean they had push carts and wagons out of which they would sell vegetables and things like that. But my great-grandfather made it into a bit of a business, where they had a storefront and things like that. And as a businessman, he needed an accountant. He's Gujarati. Gandhi was in South Africa. He was a lawyer. He was Gujarati, too. They happened to share the same accountant. The accountant introduces them, and my great-grandfather and Gandhi become friends. Gandhi lives in Johannesburg. My great-grandfather lives in Pretoria. Gandhi would have to come to Pretoria to negotiate with the government, through all his agitations. And he'd stay with my great-grandfather. And one day they're sitting around, and he says to my great-grandfather, people don't seem to have the spine, the courage to fight this racial injustice in this country because they're fearful it'll cost them something. And that was very true of Indians in many places in the diaspora, in that they were there, they kind of wanted to keep their heads low. Gandhi wanted to form an ashram or a commune to train people to go to prison, basically. And he asked my great-grandfather, can you give me your son, 7 years old at the time, this is the man who would become my grandfather, as my youngest student. And my great-grandfather was thinking to himself, we're Muslims. You're a Hindu. How can I send my son in his formative years to be in a Hindu ashram? And Gandhi says, I will read your religion. I will learn it to teach it to him. And Gandhi not only read Islam, he read Judaism, he read Christianity, and of course Hinduism. And that became part of his pluralistic view of the world. But my grandfather became the youngest of 70 inmates, if you will, on this commune who grew up self-sufficient, no hot water, no meat. You grew all of the food you ate. And the point was to be ready to fight injustice and go to prison if you have to.
Yeah, the Tolstoy farm, as I recall, it was called.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, remarkable. So from there, you talk about moving from South Africa to Kenya to Canada, and I want to get back to Kenya in a moment. But you say as a kid, this is on page 70. As a kid, I never understood it. If I'm being honest, you're talking about your father here. Being his son sometimes bordered on the unpleasant. We didn't have any leisure activities. It was always work, politics, volunteering, that sort of thing. I grew up thinking that life was not fun, although it's not to say that our lives are miserable. This seems kind of consistent with the immigrant experience as I've learned about. My grandfather was a Norwegian immigrant to the United States in 1917. Came and lived in Chicago, and he and his three brothers started a furniture building, fine furniture store. They were craftsmen. And I certainly saw that in my grandfather. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I write about it that way because as a kid, comparing yourself to other kids for whom that ethos didn't exist because it didn't need to exist. They were living in Canada. There was no particular challenge to doing so. In my family, they were on this decades-long search for democracy, equality, full participation in society. So all of their work was going to go into that. It was going into building civil society because as people who grew up in South Africa who could not vote by virtue of the color of their skin, they were going to take every possible opportunity they could to be involved. So they would volunteer for organizations. They went to all the functions of all the political parties. There were three major political parties at the time to try and figure out where they felt most at home. They ended up learning that they were liberals in Canada, which is how it was for most immigrants through that generation. But it wasn't leisure and it wasn't fun. And it's not that I think my parents wouldn't have enjoyed leisure or fun, but they were on a mission. They had to leave their home country. They had gone to another country to make a go of it, and they weren't able to do so. So Canada was the last stop. It had to work for them, and that meant we were not going to have a carefree upbringing. We were going to work. We were going to talk. We were going to talk about the news. We were going to watch the news. We were going to debate issues, and we were going to come to conclusions as a family. And then we were going to exercise our civic responsibilities, the least of which was voting. I mean, we worked in every election I could remember since I was a little kid. But the point is, voting was the price of admission. It was everything else that mattered.
Yeah, I get it. It was that way with my father and grandfather as well. Moving along to page 97, the Pretoria bakers called up your dad and asked him to stop. The bread war dragged on and on. At that point in July 1960, my father, mother, and grandparents decided to leave. We're talking about now leaving South Africa and going to Nairobi, Kenya. Tell us about that.
My dad had two sisters who had married people who were from Kenya. So we had some footing there. It was also a very, very big center for Indians diasporically. So we knew people there. My parents could see the writing on the wall because my grandfather and my father and his brother were running this family bakery, which had become a very big operation. It was a commercial bakery. They baked 4,000 loaves of bread an hour. And of course had attracted the ire of the government because they were taking the money from that bakery and they were financing anti-apartheid activities. They were doing the kinds of things to make society a better place. So ultimately, the government came in and their fellow bakers sort of forced them out of business. The government came in, bulldozed the bakery. This was 1961. My dad and my grandfather were standing together watching the bakery come down, this bakery they had built. My dad said it was the only time he ever saw his father cry. And strangely, my 58-year-old grandfather was dead a week later of a heart attack. My father thinks it's heartbreak as much as it was heart attack, but he died of a heart attack. My parents then decided, let's get out of here. So they moved to Kenya, pre-independence Kenya. It was a colonial country. And one day, Tom, you and I can talk about all the great things colonialism did for the world. It kind of wrecked every country it ever went into.
Yep.
But Kenya was on the verge of throwing off the yoke of colonialism, and they wanted to be in a free country. So even when they got there, it was a colonial country, but it was not like South Africa. It didn't have that Byzantine set of racist rules that was apartheid. People could walk on the same sidewalks. Everybody went to the same movie theater. It was racist. There's no question. But it was better than South Africa, and they were hoping that was going to be their future. It was ultimately where I was born.
Yeah. Now, moving along, the chapter about splinters and asses, I have to be careful. We're on commercial radio. My parents had never embraced South Africa art and culture, you write on page 99, because they'd been told under threat of force that it wasn't theirs. But then on page 118, you talk about in South Africa, my parents had been citizens, albeit second class. Now, Kenya offered them true citizenship. I think you just mentioned that. But then you got into Ismaili Muslims. This is a word I was unfamiliar with, and I learned about. Okay. So tell me about the type of Islam. You're a member of a very, very small minority group within a very large religion.
Yeah, it's probably tens of millions around the world, but in the context of Islam, it's tiny. Some Muslims think of Ismailis as heretics, but that's how religion goes, right? People don't necessarily. The ones closest to you are the ones most troublesome. It is a sect of Islam that embraces modernity and pluralism and democracy, and sort of encourages people to be civil actors, right? Encourages people to build the countries in which they live. And as a result, it has a remarkably robust infrastructure within the community. So you can exist as an Ismaili, and it'll take care of your births and your deaths and your financial counseling and your language training and your job training and your marriage counseling if you need it. So that's the world in which they grew up. And what typically happens with Ismailis around the world is you will see them being the people who hold office or work in the bureaucracies or find themselves into sort of areas of employment that are a little less than traditional, because they are born organizers within the community and then without as well. So that is what primed my family, and so many others, by the way, who came to the Western world and moved into the democratic world, to sort of not have a very long transition period, to be able to get in here and say, I'm here. Where do I sign up? What do I have to do to be full participants?
Finish that thought, and then I'd like to move along.
Yeah, just I was saying that Ismaili Muslims, and there are many you'll know, you just may not know them as Ismaili Muslims, but they tend to sort of lead the pack in terms of the way we think about pluralistic civil societies, right? The idea is that you are built within the community through the roles you play within the community, and they're all volunteer roles, to transfer that type of thinking into civil society. And that worked very well for my family, to the point that 10 years into being in Canada, my father sat everybody down, sat his friends and family down, and said that he would like to run for office. Yeah,
and good and amazing, great stuff. On page 148, you talk about, and this pinged for me because I was in Uganda in 1980 when during the famine there as a relief worker. And you write, for any country, absorbing immigrant families one by one is easy enough, but when they come in waves, you face real challenges. And you talk about Uganda's Asians being expelled in 1972, and Canada accepting several thousand of them, and just the impact of that. And then a little farther on page 170, you talk about how the Quebecois, I think it's pronounced. I forgive my terrible French. Don't want to lose their culture, and yet so much of their culture is tied up in being white rather than just speaking French. And you write, it's racist, but I get it. They believe if they lose this battle, French will be gone. And the Quebecers weren't, if they weren't white, we wouldn't call them racist at all. If they were indigenous, we'd celebrate them. Can you speak to this whole issue of language, race, culture?
We have a lot of contemporary examples of it, right? Hungary is one of them, where the language is sort of largely mutually unintelligible to anyone around the country. So, Viktor Orban, who's sort of a dictator, even though they still have the vote in that country, is the most anti-immigrant leader in Europe, because he says if these people come in and affect our language, we will lose all our culture. We're actually seeing it, Tom, right now in India, right? The world's largest democracy is having a very drawn-out election in which Narendra Modi is suggesting that sort of other influences, he's mostly talking about Muslims, are affecting India's purity. That's the same thing in Quebec. They used to use the term pure laine, which is French for pure wool. That's how they described a real Quebecer. Now, I do not want to paint everybody with the same brush. There are a whole lot of Quebecers who are contemporary, modern thinkers, pluralistic thinkers, who understand that they would like to keep their language, but there are a whole lot of people in the world who speak French. There are just not a whole lot of white people in the world who speak French who want to go to Quebec. And this started to stymie Quebec's growth. It led, of course, to a separatist movement that became violent. And ultimately, they had a referendum that the separatists lost by a hair. But what happened is a whole bunch of people left Quebec. A whole bunch of people who used to be in Montreal moved to Toronto. Toronto was the podunk little city. Montreal was the big city. And they left. They just went. A lot of Jews left. They said, well, I'm not feeling so comfortable around here. A lot of businesses left and went elsewhere. So my argument is largely it's an ode to immigration, and it's an ode to what America can do better. It's an ode to the idea that refugees end up being pretty good. It's an ode to the fact that immigrants do not commit more crimes than native-born people, nor do they drive wages down. The experiment really worked in Canada, but the Uganda refugee crisis is what got to test it for Canada. They actually wanted to do it that way, but Canada took in a disproportionately high number of Ugandan refugees compared to, let's say, the United Kingdom, which is supposed to have taken them in because, in theory, they were British subjects.
Ali, on page 182, you talk about your parents arriving and starting their travel business in '71 and joining the Liberal Party in Canada in '72. And how how that worked, and in fact you go on page 185 about how we don't have in Canada. We didn't have 50 different election systems, just one. Election periods are proscribed, are short, 6 weeks, tight limits on campaign finance. What can America learn from Canada?
I mean, this was the heart of the book. This is literally what I was trying to explain to people. Voting does not have to be complicated. It just doesn't have to be that complicated. We figured it out in Canada. You are assumed to be registered to vote. You don't have to do it the other way. You don't have to go there. People come to your house to try and find you to make you vote. There's none of this nonsense about it being illegal to help people vote, help people register to vote, give them food if they vote. I mean, when my dad was running elections, we literally fed, which is the way it should be. We should be providing every incentive possible to make it easy for people to vote. And again, Tom, voting is the price of admission into a democracy. It's the least of the responsibilities that you have as a citizen. And many of the arguments I make in the book is that there's much more that we can do. If you feel imperiled, which I kind of do, I do think that democracy in America is imperiled and around the world is imperiled. We have agency. We have the ability to actually do that. But that's my belief has always been, let's make it as easy as we can for people to vote. And Canada is a fantastic example of how to do that. I understand everybody wants to do it differently. It's 50 different presidential elections, but we could just employ best practices, right? We could all get together and say, which are the ones that work the best? Which are the ones that really don't? Because it makes it hard for people to turn out and vote. I was in Philadelphia the other night. They had a municipal election. The turnout was 19%. We have a lot of work to do, Tom, when we've got 19% turning out for some elections, especially things like local elections, which really matter to your day-to-day life. So I really want to make it easier to vote, and then I want to make people understand that citizenship is not just a series of rights, it's a series of obligations as well. I get it. We just have a minute left here before we hit the break at the end of this block. You write on page, 238, the arc of history bends the way you bend it, your earliest impression of America when you were living in Canada and watching American television. And you say, we didn't have guns in Canada, and Toronto's brick houses didn't catch on fire. You want to speak to that? Yeah, it was funny because we got our American news from Buffalo. You know, most of the Canadian population lives within 200 miles of the U.S. border, so they get American TV. And the lead on the news, the local news every night was either a fire or some kind of gun battle. And I really grew up thinking America was on fire and everybody was doing battle all the time. Obviously, America is much more sophisticated than that, and I learned that. But that was the distinction. The other thing that really upset me is they ran commercials for Carvel, and there was no Carvel in Canada. So I kind of grew up hating America just a little bit because I could never have that Carvel ice cream. The ice cream. And then you finally you talk about the movie Gandhi, Martin Sheen, in that he's the guy who inspired you, that character. That's right. Webb Walker was a real guy. He was a real reporter, and he was there covering Gandhi's Salt March to the water. And it was one of those things where it was sort of a pointless march. People were just getting beaten by the soldiers and injured. But he called in a dispatch, and that made it to the newspapers. And that's how the world saw what was going on. And that, Tom, takes us full circle to the whole point of being a journalist. And that is we bear witness to show people the things that they cannot see themselves, and then we hold them to account. There you go. The book is Small Acts of Courage by Ali Velshi. Ali, thanks so much for dropping by today. Thank you for having me on, my friend. That's been an honor.